Welcome to today's RMIT Cyber Series talk. I'd like to start by welcoming our guest speaker for today, Dr. Shaanan Cohney. Shaanan is a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, where his research centres on the interplay between computer systems and the law, with a particular focus on the applications of cryptography within the Centre for AI and Digital Ethics. His prior experience includes secondments to government organisations, where he specialises in policy development. In 2019, Shaanan was the inaugural Gala Fellow of the Wharton Public Policy Initiative, with a summer placement in the Office of Policy and Planning at the Federal Trade Commission, where he assisted in the development of technology strategy within the Commission. In 2018, he served as a Cybersecurity Fellow, working on the US federal technology policy in the office of Senator Ron Wyden. Prior to that, he spent 3 months at Facebook headquarters working to ensure secure deletion of user data. Shaanan completed his Ph.D. at the University of Pennsylvania in Computer and Information Science. He obtained a Master's in Law from Penn Law, his Bachelor of Science and Diploma of Musical Voice Performance from the University and Conservatorium of Melbourne, respectively. He has received numerous research awards and recognitions, and is also affiliated with Princeton University Centre for IT Policy, where he was previously a postdoctoral research associate. Today his talk is titled, "Too Important to be Left to Chance."
And the DES algorithm ruled the land. This was a great algorithm. Everyone collaborated happily on it. Government agencies contributed to make it secure. Industry contributed the actual design of the algorithm. And overall, this was a fantastic time for those in cryptography. Or was it? A few decades passed, and Edward Snowden leaked a number of slides. So these are actual slides from the Snowden leaks. He was a contractor at the National Security Agency and went rogue, became a whistleblower, publishing materials that he thought were in contravention of human rights in the US Constitution. And in his slides, he showed that the US government believed that it was able to break cryptography, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, decrypts, and somehow on a mass scale, break the encryption that was used to protect US consumers' data and data all across the world. So these slides required some interpretation. How exactly they were doing this wasn't clear. And this also is a slide from the National Security Agency. They were obviously very happy about their ability to decrypt anything. And this slide itself was also, as you can see at the top, classified top secret, and released only to the USA, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and New Zealand, which compose the Five Eyes intelligence gathering network. So, meanwhile, in cryptographer land, we were kind of at peace. We thought everything was going great. And we came up with a way to create secure cryptography, which generally involved using some randomness to make cryptographic keys, and these cryptographic keys would be used as part of algorithms that would provide super strong protection for all our data. Now, not every crypto system that the cryptographers came up with required randomness, but it was really a key component of many of the different schemes. Cryptographic security, at least as far as the cryptographers were concerned, required a good source of random data, something that was unpredictable that they could use as part of a pseudo-random number generator that would produce the random output that would then become crypto keys. So schematically, we have it below: some environmental entropy, some chaotic data. You feed that into some mixing function that mix up all that data. You feed in some more data, you mix it up more, and then from that, you extract cryptographic keys. Seems pretty good if you can't predict the environmental entropy and you mix it up sufficiently. If you mix it up sufficiently, you should be able to get pretty good cryptographic keys that no one can guess. Now, obviously, if someone can guess the environmental entropy really well and you don't do a good job of mixing it, then this pseudo equation doesn't work and the crypto keys are not secure. And if the crypto keys are not secure, your cryptography is not secure. So taking these two pieces, the view of the cryptographers that everything's going great, and the Edward Snowden slide with the happy dance, these two don't seem to match, which motivated my line of research and the research of the others mentioned in the acknowledgements, which was to study pseudo-random number generators and to try and figure out if this is the place that's going wrong, such that the NSA was able to decrypt everything. Because if the NSA could break the pseudo-random number generators, they could get the crypto keys, and if they can get the crypto keys, then they've got the decrypts, and we're back to happy dance. Now, this is particularly interesting because most pseudo-random number generators actually form part of public standards, or in some cases, annoying standards that you have to pay money for. These standards that are in use largely derive from a series of US government programs. Why? Well, the US government is one of the biggest customers for cybersecurity equipment. And so if you don't implement the algorithms that they require to be in all the equipment that they purchase, you're missing out on a large part of the market. And if you're already customizing your products to be certified for the US government market, why would you bother adding in all these other algorithms and making it much broader? Essentially, you're going to make the US government algorithms the ones that are standardized the default. And these standards largely take place in two different programs that are going to be mostly the focus of today's talk. The first are the Federal Information Processing Standards, which lay out what the different algorithms and designs that are necessary to be used in government agencies are, and the Cryptographic Module Validation Program. Now, the CMVP is a program designed so that you can certify that your products meet the FIPS standards, which is this Federal Information Processing Standard. And you'll note that the number of the FIPS that I'm talking about in this talk is 140-2. As of today, we have 140-3, which ameliorates some of the problems that we'll talk about. But really, the heart of this is the few pseudo-random number generators that were in this earlier standard. And if you apply for cryptographic module validation and you pass the certification, then you can serve government contracts and all is peachy. There are a whole number of substandards that went into the development of FIPS. There is a specific publication called FIPS 186, which is like tied into the whole thing. And then some earlier standards from the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, that were as early as 1985 that had some of these pseudo-random number designs that we'll talk about. And then more federal government publications. That's the SP down there, Special Publication 890, which laid out the full design details of the random number generators and how they should be used. Whoa, okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful. No one cares that much about standards, but should we pay a little bit more attention to them? Well, perhaps. FIPS PRGs, pseudo-random number generators that are part of these standards, are incorporated into almost all products and libraries. And when they're used, they must be used for all system functions. So all the randomness that you use has to come from these, which means this is the only place that randomness for cryptographic protocols comes from. And so all the different cryptographic keys that you use in a FIPS certified product must be generated by the FIPS random number generator. So it turns out that these standards are kind of the linchpin in this whole process. So how are they actually used? Well, let's say Alice and Bob want to share a secret. Now, many of you have probably seen this before, but to refresh your memory, we'll do a cartoon example. So Alice wants to communicate with Bob secretly. She does so using this secure algorithm. In this case, AES will be our algorithm. I'm just picking one of the most reputable ones. We'll encrypt the message M under the key K. So you have your key K from the random number generator, you have your message, and you combine that using an algorithm called AES to give you to encrypt your message. But this picture isn't complete. We don't know where the key K comes from. In this case, we're going to perform a key exchange protocol. This is just one example, a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And from this multi-party protocol, we're going to generate the key K. We're also going to include a signing mechanism, so for authentication, so that Alice knows that it's really Bob to whom she's speaking, and Bob knows that it's really Alice to whom she's speaking. So this has a whole bunch of different ingredients. We also are going to need to use some random numbers that we call nonces that we include in this protocol to ensure that if you saw this communication once and replayed it back, so if you saved the log of the communication and replayed it again, you'd be able to detect if it was being reused. So this provides us reuse resistance. Now, as part of this protocol that we've just sketched out, all the things highlighted in red are sourced from the random number generator. And in particular, if some of these values leak, particularly A and B, which are secret numbers, then the protocol is no longer secure. RA and RB are actually public, so if someone was spying on the communication, they'd just be able to see RA and RB, which is fine. The protocols are designed that way. But if there's some way of seeing RA and RB and of using that to reconstruct what the other values are, then we're in a whole world of pain. If the attacker predicts the pseudo-random number generator output, she breaks the protocol. This is because A and B are the secret values, and they're what we use to generate the key K. So again, if you can figure out what A and B are, this whole protocol is broken. Let's see what this looks like in a real random number generator, and if we can break the random number generator and as a result break the whole protocol. We're going to do a warm-up case study, which was ANSI X931, which was an earlier piece of research I did. This is what the design of the random number generator looks like. There are a whole series of iterations, and on each iteration, mix the prior state of the pseudo-random number generator with the current time. From that, you're going to run it through AES with a different key, K. This is not the same key, K, as we had in our protocol before. This is just a key for the pseudo-random number generator. So you have some key, K, you take the time, you take what was previously in the random number generator, you mix them together, and you get the output. And in this case, the way we mix things together is just by using AES. Now, one thing to remember about AES is it's both a way of encrypting things and decrypting things. That'll be important in a minute, so keep it in mind. This random number generator has a history like any other. In 1985, a DES-based version of this was standardized. Now, DES was like an earlier version of AES. In 1992, it was adopted into FIPS. In 94, it was included on a list of approved random number generators for FIPS. In 1998, a version using triple DES, which is again another variant of a block cipher, was standardized. And then in 1998, John Kelsey and his co-authors pointed out that if you know the key K, then you can actually predict what the random number generator is going to do, and it's not really so random. Did the US government decide to stop using the random number generator because of this attack? Well, 6 years later in 2004, this random number generator was included in the next version of FIPS. In 2005, the variant with AES that I had on the prior slide was included and then approved for an even more recent version of FIPS. And it took until 2011 for this design to be deprecated. And it was only in 2016 that it was finally removed from the list of approved standards. Now, maybe this isn't such a problem. Let's see. This is the problem that Kelsey et al. Pointed out. So if you know the key K for some reason, if you're an attacker and you can figure out what the key K is, and you have a good guess of the time at which something random was generated, well, this whole process becomes invertible, which means we can reverse the process and figure out what the state of the random number generator is. And if we can figure out the state of the random number generator, then we can predict what the next values from the random number generator are going to be, which makes them not random. And the way we predict it is we take the state that we just figured out, we take the time at which we think the next value was generated, and we combine those two together, mix it up with AES, and we have the new random value. So following this path kind of along, unfortunately on Zoom it's a little hard to do my gesturing, but you'll just have to imagine my finger tracing a line from RI, which is the value we know. We have a guess for TI, and we can invert this process to figure out the VI, and we just keep guessing different values of different values of T, guessing different timestamps until we find a value of the timestamp that allows an equation to hold that matches one random value we've seen with another random value we've seen, because there's a unique value of the state, counting for collisions, that will match up between two different timestamps and two different outputs. Now, if that was a little tricky to follow, not so important, but we are going to repeat that process again with some of our later pseudo-random number generators. Now, this might not be a problem if the key K is truly secret. If this key that's used for the pseudo-random number generator is constantly refreshed and totally secret, we're still chill. But the pseudo-random number standard didn't say very much about it. It just said for AES, 128-bit key, let K be a 128-bit key. This K is reserved only for the generation of pseudo-random numbers. So no guidance about how secret this key K is and how important it is to the security of the overall system. The standard did not specify that it's a bad idea for everyone to use the same key and for it to be hard-coded. But maybe people are smart enough. I don't know. We'll see. Well, FIPS 140 actually requires vendors to document how they're generating the key and how they're storing the key, and requires these documents to be made public if they're going to be part of the CMVP, this certification process. So I and my co-authors searched every single document that was published as part of this process to see if anyone actually admitted to hard coding the keys in a bad way. What did we find? Well, out of all the implementations that we looked at, which was roughly about 300, 127 didn't provide enough information. 149 was pretty clear that they weren't vulnerable, at least taking them by their word. But in 12 cases, not only were they vulnerable, but they admitted that they were vulnerable with language such as compiled into binary, hard-coded, static, injected during manufacture, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of puzzling. You would have hoped they would have had some cryptographers on staff and would have known a little better. But just having this flaw doesn't mean that in practice we can break the cryptography. This is still a bit of an engineering challenge. So we set out to validate the findings. Does this problem with the design of the cryptographic generator actually lead to being able to break it in practice? And is this something the NSA could have done? Well, unfortunately, we couldn't obtain most of the devices out of the 12 that were vulnerable. One manufacturer that we contacted had even lost access to the source code, so if even they didn't know whether they were vulnerable or not. But we did obtain a copy of FortiOS v4 and a compatible device. Now, FortiOS is a network operating system used on hardware devices that control network traffic, and they are, I think, the second or third largest manufacturer at the time of this talk for all network devices across the world. Yeah, third largest, so Cisco, Juniper, and then FortiGate. And reverse engineering their code, this is what I found. This is the initialization code for X931. Obviously, because it's reverse engineered, I had to write this code myself and check it against the compiled code. And this is what I found. There is a hard-coded AES key right there, waiting for me to extract. Now, this is not just any X931 hard-coded key. This is in fact the key that was provided by the American National Institute of Standards to allow people to test the random number generator. Now, obviously, it is a terrible idea if someone gives you a cryptographic key to test your thing to then use that key in production. Very bad idea. That is the single best known cryptographic key for this generator and is, of course, terribly insecure. So now that we know the key, we can apply the attack of Kelsey et al. If we see the two random values RA and RB and want to guess the value in the middle, say GA, the value A that was used to compute G to the A, we can perform the attack by guessing at what time RA and RB were generated in order to figure out A. Actually, my mistake, because only one of these sides is using the random number generator. We see RA and we are able to compute GA if we guess correctly the timestamps, because we know when we correctly guess the value of A and the value of the state that we can compute GA correctly. So we need raw random number outputs for this state recovery attack, because obviously GA is the result of some computation. So we use the public value RA in order to perform this computation. And then after the state is recovered, we can then recover the secret exponents, figure out the key, and the mallet in the middle can perform the attack. So with the FortiOS hard-coded test vector key, this attack is viable. And it took us only about 2 to the 25 brute forcing timestamps to do state recovery. And so this is work that can be done on your standard laptop pretty quickly. We performed whole internet scans to successfully recover private keys against people using this network device in the wild. And as a result of our findings, the random number generator is no longer included in FortiOS. FortiOS v4 was patched and FortiOS v5 doesn't use it. Scanning the entire internet to see how many devices are out there, in 25 million hosts that responded to our queries, we found 25K that were vulnerable. Using another protocol, IKEv2, which is a VPN protocol, 7 million hosts responded, of which 14 were vulnerable. And assisting us in this work were fingerprints to identify these devices that were helpfully collected by the NSA and then leaked. And this is the result of a court case, which I think was just resolved in the past week, where the leaker of these fingerprints went to jail for a very long time. So there's our simple case study. Seems potentially viable, but not so many hosts. 25K doesn't seem enough for a happy dance. What about counter DRVG? Well, this is another one of the random number generators that was present in the standard. It was in SP 890 and FIPS 142, so these are some of the newer standards, and was a successor design to the prior one that we saw. A little bit more complicated, but some of the same ideas. Changes, well, now instead of having a timestamp, there's going to be a counter that's initialized to some unpredictable value, and we're going to increment the counter with each round. We'll have a way to add in stuff like timestamps and other environmental entropy so that the mixing process mixes in some more randomness every time. And it's going to use a 3-stage process. So at every stage, there's going to be a key K, the value of the counter, increment the counter, and some additional input taken from the environment. Mix it together using AES just like before, only this time, instead of just taking the output and using that as the random number generator, we're going to take the output from AES to get a new key K, so the key is no longer static, and we'll get a new counter as well. So every time the counter is going to be mixed up. Then we're going to repeat this process with the key K and the counter, increment the counter, mix it up, and generate some output. And then rerun the first step again. So take your key K, increment the counter, mix in some additional entropy, put it through AES, and you get a new key K and a new counter. So this seems like it should be immune from our prior attack because the key is changing all the time. The state is no longer predictable, and there's a way to mix in a lot more entropy a lot more frequently. So there are two problems that we identified and that were also identified partially by Dan Bernstein around the similar time. So the first problem is that the key is not rotated until after the encryptions are done. Problem number 2 is that although you can add in this additional entropy from other sources to make it more random, this is optional in the standards, and it's up to the implementer to decide what this additional entropy is. So that seems like there might be some room for mischief. With problem 1, an attacker might be able to compromise the key K using a side channel attack that leaks the key. An attacker can then decrypt the output to reverse this and go back to the key K and the counter. And in stage 2, you repeat this process of generating output as many times as you need in order to generate as much output as the user requested. So if you just requested one set of output, this wouldn't be much use to you because it takes a lot of output to see in order to mount this attack that will compromise the key K to perform this leakage-based side channel attack. But if a user asks for a giant chunk of output all at once, that'll give you enough opportunity to maybe compromise the key. This would all be fine still, except that the attacker, if add-in is optional, doesn't need to worry about guessing add-in to calculate the updated state. So this allows you to go from your guessed key and your guessed counter directly to the new key K and the new counter. And this is if add-in is used at all. It might not be. What does FIPS 142, which was our standard document, say about the worry that this key K will be leaked by a side channel attack? Not much, unfortunately. Cryptographic modules may be susceptible to other attacks for which testable security requirements were not available, blah, 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 blah. Power analysis, timing analysis were attacks outside the scope of this standard. Unfortunately, not much guidance to preventing this attack. It's considered to be outside the scope of the standard. Does this lead to problems? Let's see. We'll find pseudo-random number generators with leaky implementations and magnify this leakage over many encryptions. So again, back to me and one or two of my co-authors going through all these certificate documents again, reading them, and seeing if there was any indication in the language they used that they were implementing this in a bad way. Once again, FortiOS was the best candidate, only now they are using version 5 with the updated random number generator. So you can imagine there are some folks at FortiOS who aren't super happy with me. So reverse engineered the code again and varied the parameters from their implementation to simulate a few other implementations so that we only had to reverse engineer one of these. And these 3 different implementations were the OpenSSL FIPS module. OpenSSL is the most widely used cryptographic library in the world. NetBSD, which is an operating system, and of course FortiOS. We used the flush and reload side channel attack on the implementation of AES that they used. For those interested in the details, it was a T-table attack. We slowed down the processor of the systems by flushing cache lines to allow us enough time to mount this attack. And it succeeded in 12% of trials with a maximum time of 19 seconds in order to carry out this portion of the attack. So 12% might not seem super high, but the old adage goes in cryptographic attacks that attacks always get better. So this is just a first bash at it. Is this a real world problem in a protocol rather than just for the random number generator? So going back to our Alice and Bob are communicating, is there a scenario in which the attacker is actually going to be able to compromise the pseudo-random number generator key during the execution and as a result recover the cryptographic secret? Now remember, this is pretty difficult because we both need an implementation that doesn't use additional entropy and also where the attacker requests a large amount of random data all at once such that we can perform this pseudo-random number generator attack. Empirically, you need about 2,000 bytes of randomness in one single shot in order to recover the key. The prior attack that we looked at used a little nonce, that random small value that was used as part of the protocol for compromising the state, but this is a small value and so it isn't anywhere near the 2,000 bytes that we need. So we looked at the protocols and tried to find a place that would generate enough random data in one shot. RSA PSS padding, a form of cryptographic encryption, unfortunately didn't work. Implementations didn't implement it right. Extended random, this is an addition to TLS that would allow you to request larger amounts of random data, not widely enough implemented, didn't work. PKCS number 1 v1.5 padding. Some of you may have heard of this from a number of other famous attacks. Well, this form of padding uses a large number of padding bytes that is related to the modulus length for RSA and the message length. So if we can request a really large sized RSA key, so maybe like 8092 bits, 4096 bits, maybe that'll generate enough random padding if we use a short enough message such that we can run our attack. Let's try it in the wild. What do we get? Well, in theory, these attacks are predicted to be somewhat difficult for NetBSD, which mixes in some extra random time data. OpenSSL FIPS also mixes in some random time data, but we actually found that in practice, the time to break was really short. For FortiOS, they didn't bother with any additional entropy, and so our 12% attack worked right off the bat. The attack succeeded in expectation after 2 to the 18 handshakes, so assuming that we connected to a server 2 to the 18 times, one of those times would expect to find a break in the protocol. And we use this to recover long-term secret keys. So this wasn't just a problem for the individual protocol execution. This was a problem whenever that server would subsequently make connections, because we were able to recover long-term private keys that were used as part of the signing algorithm in the cipher suite we chose. Whoa, okay, so we've got 2 pretty bad random number generators, but we still haven't found out how the NSA is really breaking everything. This is the role for our third case study, and where things get a little interesting in terms of the national security story. Like the others, we'll do a brief run of the history. Excuse me. In 2004, there was a draft proposal for this design. In 2006, there were already some suspicions from Schoenmakers and Sidorenko that this design wasn't good. They published a paper showing that there was an attack that allowed you to tell whether the output from this number generator was being generated in a truly random way or from this generator. And obviously this is not a full break on the random number generator, because the attack that you need to fully break it is where you can guess the output. And this is just being able to tell whether the output is random or not. But it's still not a good sign. So you'd hope that it wouldn't be turned into a standard. Well, in 2006, that's exactly what happened. Just like our other 2, even though the attacks were known, it was published in a US standard. In 2007, only shortly after the publication of this standard, Shumo and Ferguson demonstrated that you could, in fact, embed a backdoor in this random number generator that would allow you to guess the outputs of the random number generator. And then finally, in 2013, it was revealed that the NSA and other US officials were key designers of the standard, and Snowden revealed Project Bull Run, this big NSA attempt to both backdoor cryptographic security and decrypt everything. It took until 2014 for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the organization in charge of overseeing these standards, to remove the Julie C. pseudo-random number generator. And in 2015, our story gets even more interesting when Juniper, which had implemented this random number generator, announces that someone has gone in and changed some of the code. Let's take another quick look at our third random number generator and final random number generator design of the day. This design uses elliptic curves, which are a kind of mathematical object that we can use in group theory to do all the similar kinds of operations that we use for modular groups that were part of the Diffie-Hellman, finite field Diffie-Hellman that we did before. So this requires you to pick a curve, like a mathematical curve, and 2 points on it. NIST has a standard curve that they tell people to use and values for the 2 points P and Q. Juniper, in their implementation of the pseudo-random number generator and all their devices, used the same curve as NIST, but they used different points, ostensibly to ensure that if there was some problem with the points that they'd been tampered with and they were used for a backdoor, that they'd be immune because they used different points. This is a quick schematic of what the design looks like. You have some state S, and the state gets changed as you generate output. And you can see in the red and the blue, we're generating output of different lengths and truncating it to produce different blocks from our output. At each step, you're going to do some multiplication of the state with a point P to advance to the next state along the horizontal axis. And at each stage to generate the output, you're going to use the point Q multiplied by the state in order to get your output. So to advance, use the point P, and to get output, use point Q. Now, what happens if points P and Q are related? Then you might be able to go from the output to the advanced state without actually knowing the point P or without actually knowing what the secret state was before, because you can go from the output and use this coefficient D, which is the relationship between P and Q, P equals QD, to guess what the next or to determine what the next version of the state is. So not going to harp on the mathematics of it. You can always go back and check it out later. It's been well discussed. What's interesting is that in this leaked slide from the Snowden leaks, we saw that the NSA had been trying to insert vulnerabilities into commercial encryption systems and devices used by targets, and also were attempting to influence policy standards and specifications for commercial public key technologies, of which this could ostensibly be one. So that raises the question, was this the standard that the NSA backdoored? Well, moving on to what happened with the Juniper story, and we'll come back to the NSA in a few minutes. So Juniper discovered that there was, they published a security announcement saying that there was some way to decrypt VPN traffic, and that something had been inserted into the source code of their operating system and had been tampered with. We reverse engineered the patch that Juniper issued to fix this problem in order to see what they thought the issue was. And what had happened was someone had changed these 2 points P and Q. You can see that in the red is the point that someone had tampered with, and in green was the point that Juniper was meant to use. So while Juniper hadn't used the NSA point, they hadn't used the NIST point, they had their own point, but their own point was changed by someone. Now, the question, again, as before, is, given this changed point, if you have the ability to change the point, do you have the ability to decrypt the traffic? And if so, can you do this on a wide scale? Well, to find this out, we had to look into what was actually being used by their network operating system. And according to their documents, it was still using ANSI X931, the first broken generator that we looked at, not Julie C. And Juniper used non-default points. They used their own points, so there shouldn't have been a problem. And as they said that in their documentation, Julie C, this new random number generator was only used to generate randomness for X931 in order to fix some of the problems with X931. In theory, if one can guess the nonces as before, and if it's actually using dually C instead of X931, then we can go back to our old version of the attack, see the nonces, see these random values, and go from the random value using the value D to the value, we can go from RA to predict the value A, and break the random number generator and break the whole protocol. Now, this is a pretty efficient attack, even compared to the ones that we've seen, because if you know this secret value D, this relationship between the points P and Q, this attack is super efficient. After the state is recovered, as before, then you can recover the secret exponent A and break the whole protocol. So Skrinos has a slightly complicated version history. In the first version, it really was using X931. It was reseeded pretty frequently, and the size of the random values was only 20 bytes. In an updated version, it was changed so that dually C now feeds into ANSI X931, but a bug with the way that it is implemented means that instead of getting output from X931, you're actually getting the raw output from dually C, and X931 is never used. Another change that was introduced is the random values were generated before the keys, which is needed for our attack, and also the length of the random values, the public ones, the nonces, was made much larger, which means that the attack is efficient. And then in 2012, we saw the change where an attacker went in and changed the values of P and Q. But it seems like in this earlier 2008 version, passive decryption was enabled, so someone was possibly able to decrypt the traffic, but they would have had to know the relationship between Juniper's P and Q, whereas in 2012 with the hack, someone else hacked the values of P and Q. So how did Juniper fix the problem? Well, they just went back to their own versions of the original Q value. And then after our work, they removed the generator completely, so admitting that, yes, this was a problem. In our work, as you may be guessing, we demonstrated full passive VPN decryption against the version of ScreenOS that was used for quite a while. And this was only possible both because of the bugs in the implementation, where dually C, where counter DRBG was exposed, and because the standard was bad. We developed a scanning technique and found 3,000 devices. Then last year in 2021, the mystery started to clear. It turns out that the US government pretty clearly, we now have pretty good evidence that the NSA was responsible for the dually C algorithm, and it really urged NIST, the National Institute of Standards, to approve with their particular parameters for P and Q. Now, this isn't proof that there's a backdoor, but it's certainly suspicious given all the circumstantial evidence. The Pentagon then insisted that Juniper, the company that manufactured ScreenOS, use dually C as a condition for getting government contracts. And again, this is the way that the government has a lot of leverage. This introduced the potential backdoor with the Juniper value of P and Q. So the customers for this are, as you can see in this Bloomberg graphic, are telecommunications providers and government agencies. However, if it was the NSA that knew the value between P and Q, then presumably they wouldn't spy on their own agencies. This was a nobody but us backdoor, a backdoor that only the NSA could use because only they knew the relationship between P and Q. Juniper later said that it included tweaks that made it not vulnerable, but the implementation actually did make it vulnerable. What happened in 2012? Well, a suspected Chinese state-sponsored hacker broke into Juniper networks, changed the Q value, and then it seems that perhaps China was able to repurpose the backdoor, taking it from a nobody but us to a somebody who is not us backdoor, potentially allowing them to decrypt the communications of all the NetScreen customers. Not so great. Nobody but us? Nope. This leads us to a more generalized theory of what's going on here. And this is the second part of the work that I'm going to cover really briefly to give us a way to understand what's going on. Why are these spy agencies messing with things and why is it so effective? And this is what I call psychos or we'll get to that in a moment. Let's go back to our story. We have Stan who works at NIST. He's altruistic. He wants a secure design, but he has to work with a lot of different people. He has to work with the government man, he has to work with Jane, the developer, and he has to work with Bob, the businessman. And everyone has their own things that they want to be in their standards, their own requirements. The government guy wants to be able to spy on everyone. Jane wants a clear and easy to use bit of software, great interface that doesn't require to know all the cryptography. And the businesses want a way to be able to do their normal business processes and monitor traffic and all those kinds of things. So Stan's in a pretty hard spot, which means that standards and certifications are a great target for a government agency to try and influence. So we have this notion that already pre-existed about supply chain attacks. So these were adversarial actions that attempt to modify devices that are part of the supply chain. So these are surreptitious, and they leverage the procurement and deployment ecosystem to carry out their attacks. They're also outside of the control of any individual system administrator because it's like receiving a computer that already has a spy chip in it. At that point, it's a little too late. Now, the NSA already has, and the US government has a whole way of thinking about these, and the attacks can occur at all levels in the supply chain. But and they're also well known for doing these. These are some more photos from the Snowden leaks. And here's a photo of NSA agents as part of the Tailored Access and Operations Unit, opening up network devices, taking them out of the mail when they're on their way to someone, backdooring them, and then sending them back. So supply chain attacks are a real thing. In a traditional supply chain attack, the attack happens at the implementation phase, when you're actually building the devices and shipping them out. My notion of pre-supply chain operations is designed to think about this more broadly and recognize that attacks can happen at all stages of the business pipeline, not just at implementation. If you can poison the concept of the algorithm, if you can poison the design of the algorithm, the certification process, or the publication process, any of these steps can be used to mount an attack similar to a supply chain attack. These are adversarial, by my definition, adversarial actions that are surreptitious and corrupt the design, standardization, or certification stages of a system lifecycle, so that aren't necessarily targeting the physical chips, but target the design processes of the chips. I developed a taxonomy for thinking about these attacks and how they might happen. There are a few ways in which you can imagine a government adversary might attempt to launch them. So the first one is to use regulation, which has side effects. So, for example, restrict companies from exporting cryptography above a certain strength. This means that the cryptography will be weak, will have weak points, and building something with a weak point means that weak point might fail. You can directly mandate that there's a design flaw, but make it subtle. So this could be something like dual EC, and intentionally omit some of the details such that people don't notice the flaw. You can standardize fixed malicious parameters, so like having a value of P and Q that you know is bad. You can make the system intentionally really complex, and that will encourage the development of bugs, because the more complex it is, the harder it is to make something secure. Or you can ensure that something is excluded from the threat model such that developers don't think about a class of attacks when they're building a system or when they're certifying standardizing a system. We can apply the taxonomy to a whole range of different ciphers and pseudo-random number generators, including Simon and Spec, which were a series of lightweight ciphers which the NSA recently attempted to standardize at the International Standards Organization, I think 2 or 3 years ago. They were included in Linux/Android at the hands of a single developer. No explanation of parameter choices. There was a whole bunch of mischief that happened at ISO, and it looked to go through until Tomer Ashur and his co-authors raised concerns that there might be something fishy about the process. Eventually, in this case, the standardization failed and it was removed from Linux. Export-grade cryptography is another possible example we could look at to apply our taxonomy. This was legislation and regulation that prevented the export of military technology, which was applied to limit key lengths in products shipped outside the USA, as I just mentioned. And because these export-grade cipher suites were in TLS, that led to a whole bunch of weak spots, which led to a whole bunch of protocol breaks. There are also attacks that have, not attacks. There is an RFC which standardizes some parameters for use in Diffie-Hellman, and Valenta and I showed that under certain conditions, using these groups could lead to man-in-the-middle attacks. So just choosing questionable parameters, the part of a good algorithm, can still be a source of attacks. And then Adrian et al., which included Valenta as well, explored a bunch of pre-computation attacks where fixed or standardized Diffie-Hellman groups were used. Combining this with the weakness from the export ciphers, they were able to compromise 7% of the servers running the Alexa 1 million attacks. So these attacks are really quite a big deal. We can apply our taxonomy and see that it fits relatively well into these different kinds, failures that we've seen. X931 was a design flaw. Julie C was a combination of design flaw and poor parameter choice. And then counter DRBG, the last one we looked at, was a mix of design flaw and parameter choices. And I think that this is a really interesting framework to look at different ways that governments might attempt to ruin the security that we're at really hard work building, and also to eventually develop ways to help organizations make themselves immune. So we're almost through. These types of flaws could possibly explain some of the NSA's passive decryption capabilities of which they were so excited. But there are still some gaps between the theory of breaking things and the practice. It took a lot of hard engineering effort to make these attacks work. Another key thing that this revealed to us is that just because something is standardized and has gone through a rigorous process doesn't mean that it's secure, and that just because something is certified doesn't mean that we should necessarily trust it. Backdoors can be repurposed. There's no such thing as a nobody but us backdoor. It's always going to backfire. When we design cryptographic standards, we should be aware that trying to add in too much complexity and trying to be backwards compatible can corrupt the process. We should design things to be secure from the get-go. And yes, we do have to minimize some of the other concerns in order to come up with products that are secure. We need to design products that are anti-fragile, that are really hard to corrupt and hard for developers to implement in a bad way. We saw this a few times where developers implemented a complex standard, implemented with bugs, and as a result, the whole thing broke. And we need to build processes that are robust to bad faith actors at any stage of the pipeline. In future work, we could attempt to find backdoors through automatic binary analysis, or maybe even automatic standard analysis of standards. We could use formal models of immunization to implement crypto systems that we can be pretty certain of that even if they had been backdoored, they're still secure. And we can modify our governance organizations to attempt to prevent pre-supply chain attacks by starting with case studies of other broken protocols and then doing an interdisciplinary analysis of how to build robust organizations, robust cryptography, and robust standards processes that protect us. And with that, I will take any questions. Thank you very much for coming with me on this grand journey through cryptographic standards and through government spy agencies attempting to ruin everything. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, Shaanan. Sorry, I'm hearing my voice echoing back. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, that's good. Yep, so fascinating story. So I feel like I'm watching a exciting documentary with a great narratives. So any questions from the audience or any comments on all these stories from Shaanan? I certainly have a few questions. So while waiting for, let me check the chat at the same time to see if any of them coming up. There's a question from Chi Chong. Could we use a neural network to generate random numbers? Would it be close to true random number generator if we could?
So ultimately, neural networks are parametric models. And the main thing that makes random number generators work is that you're constantly adding in things that are hard to guess. And so while figuring out the output from a really complex function might be difficult, if it's deterministic, that could be still a significant problem. Now, there has been some work on using neural networks, random number generators. I'm not particularly persuaded this is a good path because not only are they complex, but the design paradigm that they're thinking of is let's make this really complicated and to make it hard to guess rather than let's use a process that we can formally think about in a secure way.
And a complex design is actually inviting more attacks. I guess normally that's the case in crypto. Yeah,
and you can embed backdoors in neural networks and there are all kinds of mischief you can play. there's no reason to go away from designs that we know that are pretty good in favor of something that's really untested. We just need to make sure that we actually use the good designs and the good designs are standardized and that we implement them in a way that's secure by including enough entropy. There also are ways to generate true random numbers by using things like quantum decay. So if you have a little chip in your computer that has some radioactive component, and you measure how frequently the radioactive decay is used, you can actually generate true randomness. It's totally plausible to include these. I'm not 100% sure why they're not done, probably more of a question for system builders.
Thank you, Shaanan, and also Xishong for the question. The next one coming from John. We mostly adopt US standards. Should Data 61 be developing our own standards?
So there's a bit of a temptation to follow the not invented here kind of process, but the question is, why are we more confident that Data 61 will not be influenced by ASIO or ACES or any of those organizations more than the National Institute? And NIST actually has made significant progress. They've published a report on lessons learned, and I think it is probably worth getting together as an international community to make sure that none of our intelligence agencies are backdooring our cryptography, rather than pointing the finger at one particular agency and saying they're the bad guys. We'll let our team develop the backdoored random number generators.
Yeah, I think the story of I love the story of Duo EC, where the US government is trying to get a backdoor and then it got to the Chinese. But technically, one of my question is that we cannot trust any guy who put in the P and the Q points in the elliptic curve, because they will surely know the relation, the D that relates P and Q. So how to solve that problem? Like, no one can be trusted on that.
So the easy way to solve the problem is not to use a random number generator that has a known mechanism to backdoor it. The way that's like somewhat acceptable is you can actually generate your parameters using a known open method, such as we hashed the string, there is no backdoor in this random number generator, and use that as one of the points and generated the other point from it. Or you could use something like the first 200 digits of pi or some other mathematical constant to generate your parameters for your random number generator. But that said, why would you use a random number generator that can be backdoored when you can use one that is much more difficult to backdoor and that doesn't have any known weaknesses?
Absolutely. So the next question is from Patrick. You talk about more complex, which is you go to more opportunity for hidden bugs, mostly about implementation complexity. What about mathematical complexity? For example, if the proof is complicated, maybe there is a mistake hidden in it somewhere. Is it a significant risk?
So that is a very real concern with designing cryptography, that especially as we move in post-quantum cryptography to mathematical objects that are less well understood and hardness assumptions that are less well understood, that proofs of security or tests of security, because we don't always have a formal proof for certain things, will miss things. And what the cryptographic community uses to get around this is we have a long open evaluation process where people are rewarded for finding attacks. So you get a big gold academic star if you can break one of the big candidate standard algorithms for standardization, and this happened recently with a couple of the post-quantum standards. And so if a standard survives attacks for 20, 30 years, then you say, well, we don't necessarily know that it's secure. We think the proofs hold up, or in the case where there aren't proofs, we think that the heuristics that we've got hold up, and we are willing to bet our community on that because it's the best we've got.
Yeah, the brightest minds could not solve it, could not attack it yet, so we kind of feel, okay, temporarily satisfied with the standards.
Although it is worth noting that the NSA is the largest employer of mathematicians in the United States, and so they do have a slight advantage finding holes over the rest of us academic cryptographers.
So there's probably a comment from Jonathan. Yes, I guess most intelligent agency in the Five Eyes would resist attempts to lock them out. All right, so I suppose it is a comment. Any last question for Shaanan, because we are running out of time? All right, so if no more questions, and I guess Shaanan is open for any discussion outside of the talk. Yep, so again, thanks a lot, Shaanan, for sharing very exciting stories with us and your experience attacking them, and you know, a lot of impact following. And thanks to the audience for participating in the talk. And we'll see you guys next in our next talk in the series. Again, thank you, Shaanan, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Have a great day, guys. Bye.